The 46th plenary meeting of the 10th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly is called to order. The General Assembly will continue its consideration of Agenda Item 5, entitled Illegal Israeli Actions in Occupied East Jerusalem and the rest of the Occupied Palestinian Territory, to hear the remaining speakers in explanation of vote after the vote, to be followed by the continuation of the debate on the item. Before giving the floor for explanations of vote after the vote, may I remind delegations that explanations of vote are limited to 10 minutes and should be made by delegations from their seats. I now give the floor to the distinguished delegation of Argentina.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Argentina expresses its concern at the situation described by the Secretary General in his letter of the 6th of December and his statement in the Security Council on the 8th of December. But we understand that the draft submitted to this emergency special session does not deal in a balanced way with the needs that were raised by the Secretary General. Argentina supports the request for a humanitarian ceasefire and the need to respect international law, including international humanitarian law, and the unconditional freeing of all hostages. And this includes all Israeli civilians and those of other nationalities who were taken hostage following the terrorist attack carried out by Hamas on the 7th of October. Argentina expresses its strong condemnation of the terrorist group Hamas, which is at the root of the humanitarian disaster described by the Secretary General. Given that the draft resolution does not include an express repudiation of such acts, Argentina was not able to support with its positive vote given this draft, and therefore we abstained. Also, Argentina recognizes Israel's right to exercise its legitimate right to self-defense in the context of international law and international humanitarian law. And we believe that that recognition should also have been included in the draft that was adopted by the General Assembly. Argentina would like to thank the Secretary General and his team for the efforts being made, and we pay homage to the international civil servants who, with great efforts and sacrifices, are working on the ground. A particular mention and recognition should be given to those who lost their lives carrying out their work. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Argentina, and I now call on the distinguished representative of Mexico to take the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. My country, Mexico, welcomes the adoption of the resolution by this General Assembly. It was co-sponsored by my country. With regards to the amendments submitted by the United States, while Mexico fully condemns the atrocious Hamas attacks, my country abstained since we consider the amendment distorts the essential aim of the resolution, which is a humanitarian ceasefire. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Mexico and now invite the distinguished representative of China to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, China welcomes the December 12th adoption by the Emergency Special Session of the GA of a resolution that calls for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. The resolution was co-sponsored by 104 member states, China being one of them, and we voted in favor of it. This resolution was carried by an overwhelming majority, an eloquent testimony to the international community's prevailing sentiment, and must be implemented fully and effectively. On 11th to 12th of December, on the 11th of December, I joined my fellow Security Council ambassadors on a visit organized by the UAE and Egyptian governments to the Al Arish and Rafah crossings. The humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in Gaza has reached such a point that no words can describe it. What met our eyes was way beyond the pale of human conscience, beyond the pale of the UN Charter, beyond the pale of international law. Much to our distress and anguish, killing is still afoot as we speak, and this Council, the Security Council, was prevented from issuing even the most basic of appeals, to wit, a call for ceasefire. Lately, on how to address the Palestinian-Israeli issue, we have yet again witnessed stark, naked double standards and hypocrisy of the most authentic order. Moral superiority charged slogans about human rights, humanitarianism, protection of women and children, and what have you, which some people used to glibly spout, have now taken an absurd twist all of a sudden. Their mantras about the need to punish war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity are now failing to pass their lips. Even the most basic ceasefire seems to have become a bitter pill, too unpalatable for them to swallow, something they scramble to skirt around or steer clear of. China firmly opposes and condemns all attacks against civilians. Let me be clear. When we say nothing is more precious than lives, these lives include the Palestinian people's lives. When we say women and children must be protected, they also include Palestinian women and children. When we say international law and international humanitarian law ought to be respected, and that civilians and civilian objects must not be targeted, that applies equally to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. In the current circumstances, a ceasefire should be an overriding precondition. An immediate ceasefire must be the international community's common goal and a matter of the utmost urgency. We urge Israel to heed the universal call of the international community for an immediate cessation of indiscriminate military attacks, an immediate end to the collective punishment against the population of Gaza, and an effective curtailment of the mounting settler violence in the West Bank. A humanitarian calamity never before seen has befallen Gaza. Israel, as the occupying power, must fulfill its obligations under international law, international humanitarian law. We firmly oppose the forced displacement and relocation of people from Gaza. China supports UN humanitarian agencies' continued relief operations in Gaza and calls for immediate actions to expand humanitarian access, including making full use of all crossings, including the Karem Shalom crossing, as soon as possible, so that humanitarian aid can enter Gaza with no impediment. We support further diplomatic mediation and good offices for the early release of all detainees. The question of Palestine is a stress test for the conscience of humankind, and so is the conflict in Gaza vis-à-vis what the UN can do. China, together with the rest of the international community, will continue to work towards restoring peace and saving lives in a tireless effort to bring an early end to the hostilities in Gaza and to achieve lasting peace in the Middle East. I thank you. And through the two-state solution. Thank you, Mr. President.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of China And I now call on the distinguished representative of Turkey to take the floor.
Mr. President, thank you for convening the 10th Emergency Special Session upon the request of OIC Group and Arab Group. We welcome the adoption of the resolution presented by Egypt on behalf of the Arab Group. Mr. President, almost 10 weeks now, an unprecedented catastrophe has been inflicted on Gaza. As of now, more than 18,000 Palestinians have lost their lives. Many more are unaccounted for under the rubble, and many more are wounded. These figures are not just numbers, but innocent civilians, mostly women and children. Each had dreams that have been shattered overnight. The risk of regional spillover is grave. It is crystal clear that the only way to prevent further violence and suffering is an immediate ceasefire. Unhindered and sufficient humanitarian aid is urgently needed all over Gaza through additional border crossings. Mr. President, complete disregard of most basic requirements of human decency, acts of collective punishment, and forced mass displacement of people that amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity are unacceptable. The claims that glorify indiscriminate violence as a means to achieve sustainable peace and security are totally false and disingenuous. Acts of vengeance targeting an entire population cannot be justified under any pretext. Silence in the face of such atrocities and reckless cruelty is tantamount to it giving carte blanche to and complicity with the perpetrators. The international community cannot and should not grow insensitive to the ongoing carnage in which most basic human rights, first and foremost, the right to live and to live in dignity, are being violated. At a time when we commemorate the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, medieval impulses cannot and should not be allowed to prevail. The longer the international community fails to stop this carnage and bring the perpetrators to justice, the less credibility it will be left with when it comes to addressing issues of global concern anywhere, anytime. Those who could not bring themselves to do what their conscience tells them to do cannot claim to have the moral high ground elsewhere. Since the Security Council once again failed to deliver, it fell on the General Assembly to give voice to the collective conscience of humanity, and in doing so to preserve the credibility of the UN system. On this occasion, we would like to express our strong support to the Secretary General who invoked Article 99 of the UN Charter and called on the Security Council to undertake its responsibility for the maintenance of global peace and security. It is in this spirit that we have, as Turkey, co-sponsored the draft resolution presented by Egypt on behalf of the Arab Group. In the final analysis, root cause of the problem is continued occupation of the Palestinian territory, and only through bringing an end to this inhuman occupation and recognizing the right of Palestinian people for self-determination could a viable solution be achieved. I thank you.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of Turkey, and I now invite the distinguished representative of Sweden to take the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Sweden stands up for international law, including international humanitarian law. Sweden voted in favor of the resolution because the humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in Gaza requires an immediate humanitarian ceasefire to protect civilians and enable humanitarian assistance to reach the civilian population. We also fully support a call for immediate and unconditional release of all hostages held by Hamas and other groups. Sweden fully supports the Secretary General's appeal for a decisive action by the Security Council invoking Article 99. The current impasse in the Security Council is regrettable. As pointed out by the Secretary General, the international community has a responsibility to use all its influence to prevent further escalation and end the crisis. The resolution presented by Egypt and adopted 3 days ago sends a clear message that the United Nations General Assembly shoulders the responsibility when the UN Security Council is unable to do so. 153 member states took a clear stance for international humanitarian law, which applies to all parties of the conflict at all time. The impending risk of collapse of the humanitarian system in Gaza entails potentially irreversible implications for peace and security in the entire region and places the civilian population, especially children, in desperate conditions. It is now crucial to attain continuous, prompt, secure, and unimpeded humanitarian access to Gaza. The Swedish government has presented a new package of humanitarian aid in light of the development in Gaza. The aid, which amounts to 210 million Swedish kronor, aims to meet the most urgent needs and focuses on women and children. Sweden reiterates its long-standing support for UNRWA, which heroically continues to operate in Gaza under very difficult circumstances. Sweden expresses condolences for the UNRWA staff that have paid the ultimate price, many of them together with the family members. Sweden reiterates its clear position that Israel has the legitimate right to defend itself in line with international humanitarian and international law against Hamas and its horrendous terrorist attacks, which Sweden unequivocally condemns. The purpose of a humanitarian ceasefire is to protect civilians and enable access for humanitarian assistance. It is temporary and its objectives are humanitarian. A long-term solution in Gaza cannot include Hamas. The only sustainable way forward is a negotiated two-state solution where Gaza and the West Bank are governed by a legitimate Palestinian leadership. Thank you very much.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of Sweden, and now I invite the distinguished representative of Iraq to take the floor.
Thank you, President of the General Assembly. I would like to thank you, Mr. President, for your efforts and for convening this special session. It allows the member states to convey their position and vision to the international community on the repeated aggressions waged by the Israeli occupation forces against the long-suffering Palestinian people. Mr. President, Israel has co-sponsored the resolution entitled The Protection of Civilians and Upholding the Humanitarian and Legal Obligations tabled by Egypt on behalf of the Arab group. We have voted in favor of this resolution and we welcome its adoption. We have reservations as to some of the sentences in that resolution, which could be explained as equating the Israeli occupation and the Palestinian citizens defending their land and freedom. Mr. President, the Israeli occupation forces started their aggression against the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip more than 2 months ago. They have used all sorts of weapons and indiscriminate bombardment by air, land, and sea. They have destroyed the infrastructure, schools, hospitals, houses of worship, and dwellings. Since then, the Security Council has been unable to discharge its legal responsibility in maintaining peace and security. It failed repeatedly to adopt a resolution to end the brutal massacres, genocide, and systematic killing perpetrated by the Israeli occupation forces, and claiming the lives of thousands of children, women, and elderly. They have cut off water supply and energy, closed border crossings, imposed a blockade, collective punishment, and forcible displacement against the people of Palestine. This has exacerbated the humanitarian situation and has led to a veritable humanitarian catastrophe. The Secretary General described it as being unprecedented. It has reached a stage of total collapse owing to the intensity of the military operations and will impact regional and international peace and security. I seized the opportunity to commend the role of the United Nations and its humanitarian agencies. They have discharged their mandate through the presence of their personnel in the field, the provision of assistance, and their continued humanitarian action despite the difficult circumstances. Meanwhile, the Israeli occupation forces have ignored their calls for a ceasefire, for an end to the humanitarian catastrophe, for saving lives, despite the fact that many UN personnel have made the ultimate sacrifice. Mr. President, the government of Iraq expresses its support and appreciation for the Secretary General Guterres for his principled and clear position in his letter to the Security Council on the blatant violations in the Gaza Strip. The Secretary General invoked Article 99 of the UN Charter. Iraq stresses that the humanitarian catastrophes due to that aggression have led to a humanitarian catastrophe that requires an urgent international intervention. There's a need for concerted international efforts and for a sense of responsibility to avoid the dire consequences of the widening of the conflict. What happened in the Gaza Strip since the 7th of October cannot be separated from the long-standing usurpation of legitimate rights and the continued violations by the occupation forces in the Palestinian territories, in addition to the detention campaigns, the confiscation of land, the violation or the desecration of the holy sites with impunity for more than 7 decades. Mr. President, 103 member states have co-sponsored the resolution. 99 states had supported the resolution, and 121 states voted in favor of the GA resolution in its special session on the 26th of October. This reflects the global call by the majority of the member states for a ceasefire to save lives and to end the untold and unspeakable daily humanitarian catastrophes. We are hopeful that the calls of the majority of the UN member states will be heeded to put an end to these humanitarian catastrophes, to preserve the dignity of the Palestinian people and their right to live in freedom, and to adopt the necessary measures to hold the Israeli entity accountable for its brutal crimes. Mr. President, Iraq strongly condemns the crimes perpetrated by the Israeli occupation forces, and we reiterate that in light of these circumstances and escalation, the Palestinian cause cannot be turned from a question of an usurped land and oppressed people and reduced to a question of displacement and humanitarian assistance. It is high time for the international community to adopt measures to end this suffering, which has been ongoing for more than 7 decades. We reiterate our calls to the international community in a sense of responsibility and human solidarity to demand the Israeli entity to end its ongoing aggression against the Palestinian people and to comply with international resolutions and end its aggression. In conclusion, Mr. President, we reiterate the position of the government and people of Iraq in support of the Palestinian people, of their ambitions and their right to self-determination and to the establishment of a Palestinian state on the land of Palestine. Thank you, President.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of Iraq, and I now invite the distinguished representative of Spain to take the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and thank you for convening this emergency special session on the humanitarian situation in Gaza. Spain has supported the appeal made by the Secretary General of the United Nations in his letter dated the 6th of December for the Security Council to act in order to avoid a humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza. Last Friday, on the 8th of December, Spain co-sponsored the draft resolution presented by the United Arab Emirates in the Security Council in response to that appeal by the Secretary General for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. We also call for the respect by all parties for international law, the protection of the entire civilian population, and the immediate release of all hostages, and to allow humanitarian access. We regret the fact that the draft resolution made no progress. Spain also recalls Security Council Resolution 2712 that demands that all parties comply with their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law, in particular with respect to the protection of civilians, particularly children. Since the attacks of last October the 7th, we have been reiterating our firm solidarity with Israel and condemning the brutal, indiscriminate terrorist attack by Hamas, both expressed without any reservations on several occasions. For this reason, we believe that the text of the resolution approved last Tuesday should have included a clear condemnation of Hamas. Also, from the very beginning, Spain has urged all parties to respect international law, including international humanitarian law, and we have noted that there must be responsibility taken for violations of international law. United Nations agencies are reporting that humanitarian structures in Gaza are on the brink of collapse. It is urgent to ensure that we can provide them with food, water, fuel, electricity, and medical care, as well as to provide safe shelter. Humanitarian access must be restored urgently to the level required to meet the needs of the civilian population and respond to what is already a humanitarian catastrophe. We call for the opening of additional routes to bring vital help to Gaza. In response to the UN's humanitarian appeal, since the beginning of the military operation in Gaza, Spain has tripled its assistance to Palestine this year, to a level of 48.5 million euros. The international community must join forces to end the spiral of violence in the Middle East. The Palestinians need the hope of a state. Israel needs security guarantees. In order to assume its role tomorrow in Gaza, the Palestinian National Authority must receive strong support, Arab, European, and international support. A Palestinian Authority assuming government responsibilities throughout Palestine is the best guarantee of security for Israel. Palestine also needs security guarantees that are not satisfied under the current settlement policy. I reiterate Spain's firm commitment to holding as soon as possible a peace conference with the parties and with the international community to make the two-state solution a reality. This is the path towards the inalienable objective of an Israeli state and a Palestinian state living in peace and security. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of Spain for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the observer state of Ireland.
President, Ireland co-sponsored and voted in favour of the resolution presented by Egypt on behalf of the Arab group. We did so to add our voice to the overwhelming majority of member states calling for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire and to reiterate our call for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. We welcome its adoption by this Assembly on Tuesday and urge its full implementation. The people of Israel and the Occupied Palestinian Territory deserve nothing less. After 2 months of relentless conflict, the situation in the Gaza Strip is dire. The number of civilian casualties is staggering, and it continues to grow. Thousands more have been injured and millions have been displaced. This is completely unacceptable. We condemn the daily killing of civilians and the targeting of civilian infrastructure. International humanitarian law places obligations upon state and non-state actors and must be respected by all parties to any conflict. The humanitarian catastrophe unfolding on our watch is unbearable, and it grows more urgent by the day. The level of aid entering Gaza has increased, but it is still not enough to meet the needs of more than 2 million people. It's not nearly enough. The conditions highlighted by UNRWA Commissioner General Lazzarini on 7th of December are a distressing call to action that we cannot and must not ignore. People in Gaza need water, food, medicine, and fuel. They need it now. UNRWA must be able to continue its vital work. Aid must be able to enter at sufficient scale, and safe, unhindered humanitarian access, including to children and other vulnerable groups, must be ensured. President, Ireland also supported the 2 amendments tabled on Tuesday. We did so in order to once again condemn the heinous acts carried out by Hamas on the 7th of October, which can never be justified. Accounts of sexual violence during the attacks are appalling. As this conflict persists, we must also remain vigilant to the very real possibility of further regional escalation and work to prevent it. The situation in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, is deeply concerning. More than 100 Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank since the 7th of October, coinciding with a dangerous increase in extremist settler violence. This must stop, and perpetrators must be held to account. President, Ireland commends the Secretary-General for his recent actions to address this conflict at the UN, including invoking Article 99 for the first time in 30 years. The Secretary-General's commitment to the UN playing a positive role in de-escalating this conflict is hugely important. He deserves our collective support. We welcome that the General Assembly has once again stepped up where the Security Council failed. However, we deeply regret that the Council was unable to adopt a similar resolution owing to the veto of a permanent member. As I've said many times, the veto is an anachronism that must be abolished. President, colleagues, it is imperative that we continue to work for a lasting peace in the Middle East, based on the two-state solution and respect for international law. This is the only prospect for a sustainable peace. For our part, Ireland is determined to work with international partners to deliver a durable humanitarian ceasefire and move towards a meaningful political process. It is the only way to ensure peace and security for both the Israeli and Palestinian peoples. Thank you very much.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of Ireland, and I now invite the distinguished representative of Cambodia to take the floor.
Mr. President, distinguished delegates, my delegation strongly supports the Secretary General's efforts and appeal in addressing the humanitarian crisis and ensuring the unhindered delivery of humanitarian assistance in Gaza. We are deeply concerned by the escalation of violence, untold human suffering, and immense loss of human lives. Many are women, children, and the elderly. Cambodia co-sponsored and voted for the draft resolution on the protection of civilians and upholding the legal and humanitarian obligations proposed by Egypt on behalf of the Arab group. We welcome its adoption by the General Assembly on the 12th of December. Cambodia believes that a humanitarian ceasefire is not just an obligation, but an urgent necessity to avoid further deepening of the catastrophe and horrific harm to civilian lives. It is absolutely important that all parties must ensure safe and complete access for humanitarian relief to people who are in dire need in Gaza. all parties must respect international humanitarian laws and human rights law. Using civilians as human shield is despicable and deplorable, while they must be protected, and civilian infrastructure must not be targeted. Cambodia, therefore, joins others in calling for the unconditional release of all civilians held hostage by Hamas and other parties, and voted in support of the amendment in this regard proposed by Austria. I wish to reiterate that Cambodia condemns all acts of terrorism and violence against innocent civilians, regardless of their race, culture, or religion. In the same vein, Cambodia condemns the heinous attack on civilians on 7 October 2023. We consistently stand in solidarity with the international community in the fight against terrorism in all its forms and manifestations, while fully appreciate the numerous debates over which action constitute terrorism. Mr. President, now more than ever, it is of paramount importance to address the root causes of the Palestinian-Israel conflict to enable both the peoples of Israel and Palestine to coexist side by side in peace and harmony. Cambodia urges all relevant parties to revive the efforts to resolve the conflict through diplomacy, dialogue, and peaceful means to end the humanitarian crisis and achieve enduring peace. To this end, there is a need to build conducive environment, starting with the silence of the sound of gun. Allow me to end my statement by repeating what I have said earlier. Hatred and vengeance only feed another cycle of hatred and vengeance. The current trajectory of the situation in the Middle East will neither engender sustainable security nor bring lasting peace and harmonious coexistence to the peoples of Palestine and Israel. I thank you for your attention.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of Cambodia and now invite the distinguished representative of Denmark to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Denmark is deeply concerned about the humanitarian situation in Gaza. The international community has a responsibility to prevent a collapse in the humanitarian system and to avert a humanitarian catastrophe. On this background, Denmark voted yes to the resolution before us. We would have preferred a text which unequivocally condemns Hamas' heinous terrorist attacks on Israel on 7 October 2023, and which calls for the immediate and the unconditional release of all hostages taken by Hamas. We also wish to underline that we understand the call for a humanitarian ceasefire to be a call for temporary measures to allow humanitarian needs to be met. As such, a humanitarian ceasefire does not deny Israel the right to defend itself in accordance with international law, including international humanitarian law. I thank you.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of Denmark. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Croatia.
Thank you, Mr. President. We have gathered here again at the General Assembly of the United Nations to discuss the devastating humanitarian and human rights crisis in Gaza that erupted with the heinous terrorist attack by Hamas on Israel on 7th of October. Since then, both the Israeli and Palestinian civilian population has been thrown into severe jeopardy and the region on the brink of disaster. It has also led to the death of more than 140 UN staff, the greatest loss of life of UN staff in the history of the organization. We commend Secretary General for invoking Article 99 and regret that the Security Council once again did not reach necessary compromises to be able to act. As a matter of principle, Croatia stands by the right of the State of Israel to defend itself and the state's fundamental duty to protect its population. We also support the demand for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages held by Hamas and other groups, as well as ensuring immediate humanitarian access to them. Also, as a matter of principle, we stand for human rights, protection of civilians, and the adherence to the international humanitarian law, most notably with regard to the protection of civilians. We are facing a humanitarian emergency in Gaza. Civilian casualties are mounting, including women and children. Resolution submitted to the vote is purely humanitarian, stripped of any political content. We were asked to confirm what all of us are obliged to protect: basic human rights and international humanitarian law. This, we believe, should be beyond any matter of political perspective and is in interest of all. Therefore, again, as a matter of principle, Croatia voted in favor of the proposed resolution. I thank you.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of Croatia, and I now invite the distinguished representative of Jordan to take the floor.
شكرا السيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, allow me to convey to you my sincere thanks for your response to the request to the resumption of the 10th Emergency Special Session of the GA in accordance with the United for Peace General Assembly Resolution of 1950. The holding of this meeting comes after the failure of the Security Council to adopt the resolution tabled by the UAE, the Arab member of the Council, that calls for an immediate cessation of the Israeli war against the Gaza Strip. It was in response to the letter of the Secretary General to the Security Council invoking Article 99 of the UN Charter to draw the attention of the Council to the near collapse of the humanitarian situation in Gaza and the grave situation that threatens international peace and security. Mr. President, the adoption by the General Assembly on Tuesday last of a resolution that calls for an immediate ceasefire with an overwhelming majority, that is 153 countries voted for the resolution, and it was co-sponsored by more than 100 member states, reflects clearly the collective will of the international community to put an end to the raging Israeli war waged against the Palestinian people in Gaza. Here, Jordan reaffirms the need for all states to cooperate to put an end to this war against Gaza and to make international concerted efforts to bring pressure to bear on Israel to implement the resolution and to end its barbaric attack on the innocent civilians in the Gaza Strip. This calls for a serious consideration of holding Israel accountable for its grave violations of the international humanitarian law and its imposition of collective and individual measures to stop the Israeli aggression. The movement of the international community today, Mr. President, has become an urgent need and a legitimate demand more than ever before to deter Israel from the perpetration of more inhuman crimes against the Palestinian civilians in Gaza. These crimes have led to the martyrdom of nearly 19,000 Palestinians, the majority of whom are women and children. These figures bear testament to the desire of Israel for revenge against all the people of Palestine. History proves that the carnage and wars of Israel against the Palestinian people was never in exercise of self-defense. They were always for vengeance and for the violation of the life and human dignity of this long-suffering people, and to break their will and their steadfastness. These dreams will never be realized. Israel will realize that whatever it is doing will only increase the steadfastness of the Palestinian people in their occupied territories, which they will never give up, however long it takes. Mr. President, the scenes that are being documented of the heinous crimes of Israel in Gaza day after day most recently of which the execution of civilians hiding in a school in Gaza, and the targeting of international facilities and the schools of UNRWA, as well as the stripping naked of the civilians and the use of the civilians as human shields in the military operations inside the Strip, destroy all the arguments put forward to defend Israel and to justify its crimes in Gaza. This leaves no room for doubt that this war is nothing but an aggression, a vengeance, a collective punishment by Israel against the unarmed Palestinian people. We reiterate the need for the provision of international protection for the brotherly Palestinian people, and to end the war that has entered its 70th day at a time when we see the failure of the international community to prevent Israel from its continued killing indiscriminately of the civilians and its denial of the right to food, water, fuel to Gaza's, and the use of such things as weapons, and all this constitutes additional war crimes that Israel must be held fully accountable for. The statements by Israeli officials since the beginning of the aggression, including those made in the United Nations and in the Security Council, are further proof that Israel is targeting the Palestinian civilians with a deliberate intention for collective killing, ethnic cleansing, and genocide. All these evidence will be used in holding Israel accountable legally in the future. Jordan will continue to provide assistance to the Palestinian brethren with all means available to it, including through the 2 military hospitals in the Gaza Strip and in Nablus, as well as the 2 medical stations in the West Bank. We reiterate that Jordan stands by the Palestinian people in their steadfastness on their territory, and we categorically reject any attempt to separate the West Bank from the Gaza Strip. They are an extension and an integral part of the one and united Palestinian state. In this regard, we reiterate that there will be no solution to the question of Palestine at the expense of any other country. Attempts at forcible displacement and the liquidation of the question of Palestine are red lines for the people and government of Jordan. In conclusion, Mr. President, we would like to reaffirm our conviction that the right of the Palestinians to return or compensation within a comprehensive solution to the conflict within the framework of the UN resolutions is the only way to resolve the question of Palestine on the basis of the 2-state solution and the relevant resolutions of international legality. Thank you, sir.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of Jordan, and I now invite the distinguished representative of Indonesia to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Indonesia co-sponsored the resolution presented by Egypt on behalf of the Arab group because we value human lives and humanity. Indonesia therefore welcomes that 153 countries voted in favor of the resolution. This is a clear message by the majority of the General Assembly that we refuse to be part of history that supports the killings of thousands of women and children in Gaza. We refuse to be seen as countries that turn a blind eye to the atrocities in Gaza. We refuse to be complicit in the acts of crime against humanity and crime and war crimes in Gaza. Mr. President, even after the call from all corners of the world for a ceasefire, including the action by the Secretary General to invoke Article 99 for the first time in decades, Today, we continue to witness the killings of innocent civilians, the collapse of humanitarian situation in Gaza, and the collapse of humanity. Let us be clear. What we are witnessing is bordering genocide. The irony is, all these are taking place on the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a declaration that commits to all human beings born free and equal in dignity and rights, which today clearly excludes the Palestinians. So, when is it time to say enough is enough? Is it when we reach 25,000 killed, 50,000 killed, or 100,000 killed? Is it when all the Palestinians are successfully pushed out of Gaza? It is our collective responsibility to stop these atrocities now. We urge Israel and all parties to immediately and effectively implement this resolution, because we need to stop the atrocities and save lives. We need to provide humanitarian assistance throughout Gaza. We need humanity to prevail. We need this resolution, as well as previous resolution in the Assembly and the Council, to be implemented. Mr. President, the time to act is now. Stop the killing of women and children and the cycle of violence. Uphold humanity. We must act now to uphold the UN Charter. I thank you, Mr. President.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of Indonesia, and I now invite the distinguished representative of the plurinational state of Bolivia.
Muchas gracias, Presidente.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Bolivia would first of all like to thank Egypt for submitting the draft resolution on behalf of the Arab group, and the resolution which was adopted last 12th of December in this room. We call for a humanitarian ceasefire given the enormous catastrophe at this very moment the Palestinian men and women are suffering in Gaza because of the bombs and the weapons used by Israel. And so we co-sponsored the draft resolution. Similarly, last week we supported the draft resolution in the Security Council. Unfortunately, once again, the United States blocked that resolution, a clear demonstration of the ill use of the veto, which is used by permanent members of the Security Council. Mr. President, 2 months after since the beginning of this attack against Palestinians, it's a shame that the Security Council has not sent a firm and unified message to save lives and to ensure that Israel puts an end to its genocide of the Palestinian people. This General Assembly has become a space for great speeches to say that some are doing more than others to help Palestinians, but we've forgotten the most important. We must act consistently and put an end to Israeli bombs. We must not be complicit in these attacks. The international community and international law must act against those who are responsible for these crimes. The worst in this situation is that the ongoing occupation of Palestinian territory is discussed in this room, but nothing is done to put an end to the loss of thousands and thousands of lives. And there's also the loss of about 20,000 innocent people. How many more deaths must we weep for in the world for helping these people which are looking for their independence? And how many more people must lose their lives? Israel cannot continue to act in the margin of international law. It must be held accountable for its activities. Colleagues, 75 years since the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Palestinian people is suffering the worst violation of human rights in history. The international community cannot be just a passive spectator in this conflict. All states and players involved, we must all assume our responsibility to advocate for justice and peace in the region, and this immediately. Finally, President and colleagues, Bolivia is and will continue to be on the right side of history. We will be on the side of human rights and on the side of the rights of the Palestinian people. Thank you, Mr. President.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of the plurinational state of Bolivia, and now I invite the distinguished representative of the state of Qatar.
شكرا لكم السيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. President, for the resumption of this emergency special session in view of the failure of the Security Council once again to adopt the Arab draft resolution tabled in response to the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Gaza. Our brethren are facing one of the worst humanitarian catastrophes in the world. It was a purely humanitarian resolution adopted by more than 100 states, and it came after the unprecedented movement of the Security Council through his of this Secretary General through his message to the President of the Security Council, invoking Article 99 of the Charter, calling for a humanitarian and just ceasefire. We reiterate our condemnation of the Israeli aggression, which has taken a toll of more than 18,000 civilian casualties, the majority of whom are men and children, as well as the displacement of 2 million people and the cutting of the basic human the needs of human life, the killing of journalists, in a clear violation of the resolutions of the Security Council and the relevant GA resolutions. In the same context, the message of the Commissioner General of UNRWA addressed to the President of the General Assembly on the 7th of December, saying that it comes at the darkest moment of the history of the agency that has lasted for more than 75 years. It is high time for the international humanitarian law to be applied without distinction and without double standards. Therefore, we welcome the adoption by the General Assembly on Tuesday last of the draft resolution tabled by the Arab group, for which 153 states have voted. This is a call from the international community to put an end to the bloodshed and to unspeakable human suffering. The importance of the resolution lies in its call for a humanitarian ceasefire and calls upon all parties to comply with their international obligations, particularly those under IHL, including the protection of civilians, in addition to the unconditional release of the hostages, in the ensuring the access of humanitarian assistance. It reflects the necessary and urgent humanitarian needs agreed upon. The efforts of the state of Qatar in partnership with Egypt and the USA have led to humanitarian truce for 4 days, and then it was extended to 7 days. More than 100 of the prisoners, including women and children, were released, in addition to hundreds of Palestinian prisoners in Israeli prisons. This truce allowed the access of relief assistance that is badly needed in Gaza. We continue our diplomatic efforts to extend the truce. We hope that we will be able to arrive at a comprehensive and durable solution to end the war and to stop the bloodshed of the Palestinian people, and the launching of a political process that will lead to a just and comprehensive peace in accordance with the international legality rules and the Arab Peace Initiative and the two-state solution with a independent Palestinian state in the occupied Palestinian territories with its capital in East Jerusalem, and the attainment of the Palestinian people of all their rights. The adoption by the General Assembly of the Arab resolution has given a new hope to the civilians in the Gaza Strip to restore their basic rights, particularly their right to life. It also sent a clear message that the international community, as represented by the General Assembly, is no longer able to turn a blind eye at the grave threats to international peace and security and the grave violations of international law. Thank you, sir.
I thank the distinguished representative of the State of Qatar for his statement. We have now heard the last speaker in explanations of vote after the vote. As agreed at the 45th plenary meeting on 12 December 2023, the Assembly will resume its debate on Agenda Item 5. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the State of Palestine.
Mr. President, the Israeli assault is a war against Palestinian civilians, Palestinian children, Palestinian history, Palestine presence, Palestinian existence. It targets the population, the hospitals, the infrastructure, the homes, the bakeries, the landmarks, the historic mosques and churches that stand witness to our diverse and long history. Israel has destroyed and flattened entire neighborhoods, displaced virtually every Palestinian in Gaza, brought back the scenes and memories of the 1948 Nakba with the massacres and the forced transfer of our people. It also targets our present and future, killing engineers and doctors and poets and academics. It also targets those who could document the crimes and inform the world, the journalists. We mourn one of those journalists, Samer Abu Dagga, wounded in an Israeli drone strike and left to bleed to death for 6 hours, while ambulances were prevented from reaching him. We tell his colleague Wael al-Dahdouh, whose wife Amna, his 15-year-old son Mahmoud, his 7-year-old daughter Sham, and his 1.5-year-old grandson Adam had been killed in a previous Israeli strike a few weeks ago, and who was himself wounded in the same drone strikes as Samer. Wael al-Dahdouh, after he was told about this tragedy, he said, "Ma'lish." We tell Wael, "Mush ma'lish." Enough is enough. This is how Israel conducts its assaults through atrocities, because its goal is not security, not the security of those held captive in Gaza, not the security of the Israeli people, but the destruction and displacement of the Palestinian people, even if that means prolonging the conflict indefinitely. Mr. President, a Palestinian mother looking over her little child explained, "I named him Ayub for patience. And Ayub is one of our prophets. He is the prophet of patience." She was aware that being a Palestinian born in Gaza under occupation, under blockade, he would need endless patience to endure the suffering that would be inflicted upon him. But she never imagined the suffering reaching such magnitude. Like the mother of Ayub, Palestinian parents have been praying with anguish that they would not have to wait any longer for the horrors to stop and for their children to be saved. Countries have a moral and legal obligation to act, to make the horrors stop, to save human lives. Mr. President, 1 million Palestinian children in Gaza are facing a death sentence that can take effect at any moment. Remember what the Secretary General said. The Gaza Strip is a graveyard of children. No country should be part in issuing such death sentences or accepting to co-sign with the murderers the death certificates for our children. Mr. President, people around the globe have been calling for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, of course, including the Secretary General and all the leaders of UN humanitarian agencies. The United Nations, through the Secretary General and all its agencies, have been calling for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. The humanitarian and human rights community have been calling for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. The Security Council, through 13 of its members, was ready to call for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, only blocked by one vote, one veto. The General Assembly acted where the Security Council was prevented to act, to uphold international law towards the protection of civilians and ensuring the maintenance of international peace and security. The vote was unequivocal. The world is calling for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. 157 countries voted in favor. Only 10 voted against. There is no way to end the massacres of civilians, including children, at an unprecedented pace, to address the occupation-made humanitarian catastrophe of unprecedented scale, except through a ceasefire. Do you see what our people in Gaza are enduring? Do you see our children under the rubble? Do you see them starving? Do you see them being amputated? Do you see them shivering? Our children are killed or orphaned. They know now much more about death than about life. They are not collateral damage. They are yet another generation that has fallen victim to the Israeli war machine. Our children have always been a target, with the aim to terrorize and traumatize a nation in the hope to defeat it. What is a war whose primary victims are civilians, mainly women and children? It is a war of massacres. Is there a right to massacre in international law? How could anyone defend this war when it has been led through massacres, one day after the other, even today as we sit in this chamber? Israel is treating Palestinians as it called them, human animals, slaughtering them and starving them. How can anyone support that or even stand idly by while it happens? Those who are calling for protecting civilians, for upholding the law of war, for humanitarian assistance and access, while refusing to call for a ceasefire, are delusional at best. Israel has been committing heinous atrocities for over 2 months, in fact 70 days, has been deliberately making Gaza unlivable for human life for over 2 months, has been forcibly displacing 2 million Palestinians for over 2 months. This is an integral part of the assault. It is by design criminal, aimed at inflicting maximum pain to force a people out of their country. Israel has confessed to this goal, to this crime. You cannot oppose the ethnic cleansing of our people while at the same time supporting the assault that is enabling it. For those attempting to shame those who call for a humanitarian ceasefire, you have failed. The General Assembly spoke. The world spoke. 153 countries spoke. Shame is on those who refuse to stand against atrocities. In the name of humanity, morality, and legality, the General Assembly has acted, demanding an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. Israel has failed in its efforts to bully, intimidate, and silence the member states of the UN. Member states have voted yes to the UN Charter, voted yes to the Geneva Conventions. On this 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, they voted yes for human rights. And on this 75th anniversary of the Nakba, they voted against new Nakba and never again to allow another Nakba to happen. We salute all of you who stood with the Palestinian people and who stood with justice and with international law. This vote must be followed by a resolute collective action to ensure implementation of this resolution without any further delay. Every day, every hour, every minute counts as a human tragedy continues unfolding. Mr. President, the Palestinian people are here to stay, in our homeland to stay. They are entitled to freedom and independence. This is the only path towards shared peace and security. Netanyahu is demonstrating every day that the target of this assault is the Palestinian people and the Palestinian state. He is saying it openly. Supporting this assault is allowing Netanyahu to pursue his criminal objectives. Netanyahu's place is in a court in The Hague, not in power in Israel. Mr. President, Ayub was killed with his siblings in the bombing of their home by Israel. We all failed him and failed thousands of other children, thousands of women, men, families. We are today to save all those who can still be saved. Every life is sacred, and there is nothing more sacred than the life of a child. Let's save the children of Palestine. For those who say they oppose atrocity, crimes, we ask, is there an exception if it is Israeli committing those crimes, or if the victims are Palestinians? There is no doubt that what is happening in Gaza are atrocity crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. In the face of such atrocities, there is only one moral position, one defensible position: ceasefire now, ceasefire now, and stop the genocide. Stop the genocide. Stop the genocide committed against the Palestinian people and their children. And I thank you very much, Mr. President.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of the Observer State of Palestine, and now invite to the podium the distinguished representative of the State of Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, I could stand here and repeat the horrifying atrocities committed by Hamas on October 7th, when there was a ceasefire in place that was violated by Hamas's planned massacre. I could discuss the mass rape and mutilation of women, the burning of entire families alive, the beheading of babies. But I have already stood here and showed you footage from that dark day. I have repeatedly discussed the horrors and the bloodshed, but sadly this body prefers to keep its head in the sand. Sadly, this is what the UN has become. So instead of talking about the past, I will try to remind this body of the present and talk about the future. The future that awaits us if the Hamas Nazis are not eliminated. If there's a ceasefire that will allow Hamas to regroup, to rearm, to continue their reign of terror in Gaza. That's the meaning of a ceasefire. This resolution that so many of you sickeningly, I have no other word, applauded, calls for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. So I must ask you today, what does this mean? What is a humanitarian ceasefire? Is it a ceasefire for 6 hours to allow food and water to enter Gaza? Clearly not, seeing as every single day Israel facilitates the entry of hundreds of tons of food and water. Is it a ceasefire for 3 days so that medical supplies and fuel can enter? The answer is also no, as truckloads of these supplies enter Gaza through Israeli facilitation every day. How about a week-long ceasefire to evacuate wounded civilians? No again. This is already happening on the ground, alongside field hospitals and floating hospital ships. Israel facilitates all these efforts. So I ask again, what is the meaning of this humanitarian ceasefire? There's no such a thing. This is one big lie, a whitewashing of the truth. A humanitarian ceasefire means a terrorist-saving ceasefire. We're not stupid. This resolution only seeks an end to the war against Hamas Nazis. Sorry for the words. You don't give a damn about Israel and our future. An end to the war means turning our backs on the hostages. It means ensuring Hamas's continued rule in Gaza. I don't get it. We're 18 years of oppression in Gaza, by the way, against Palestinians, digging terror tunnels into our soil, into our territory, and indiscriminate rocket fires, thousands and thousands on Israeli civilians. That wasn't enough for you? All a ceasefire secures is a future for the genocidal jihadists. It is only Hamas that this resolution is defending. Stop hiding your intentions behind your suits and diplomatic wording. Humanitarian ceasefire. This resolution has a distorted agenda. At least make this clear to all member states. This resolution aims to keep Hamas in power, period. And for those of you who may have forgotten, I want to remind you who these savage terrorists are. Because you could have said something else in your resolution. You could have called them to turn themselves in, to release all the hostages. Then the war would end tomorrow morning. Hamas is currently holding 132 hostages in Gaza. These innocents were brutally taken from their beds, from a party, from the arms of their loved ones, and they are absolutely not being treated in accordance with international law. Hamas refused to even allow the Red Cross to visit them, the most severe crimes that can exist. And this body cannot even bring itself to say their name, Hamas, Hamas. Such cowardice. But now, after some of the hostages have been released, we are beginning to hear the horror stories of what they endured. One of the released hostages, an agricultural worker from Thailand, described that the Israeli hostages held with him were tortured with electric cables. 18-year-old Itai Regev recounted that after being taken hostage, he was operated upon by Hamas without anesthesia, without. His sister Maya, by the way, who was shot in the leg before being abducted, had her bone fracture mended backwards by Hamas. 12-year-old Eitan Yahalomi was held in solitary confinement for 16 days, during which he was forced to watch the atrocities of the Hamas Nazis at gunpoint. When he cried, Hamas ISIS threatened to kill him. All of you here, all of you who have children, think about this for a moment. Hamas forced children to watch their families and friends be butchered. 9-year-old Emily Hand spent 50 days as a hostage. You know what happens? Today, weeks after her release, she still cannot speak. She's too afraid. She can only whisper. She's just whispering. Why? Because Hamas terrorists threatened to murder her if she made even the slightest sound in the terror tunnel where she was being held. There are still 132 hostages being held in Gaza. 10-month-old Kfir Bibas and his 4-year-old brother Ariel are still being held hostage. Therefore, for heaven's sake, I cannot begin to imagine the horrors they face every single day. Women, children, the elderly are suffering the unimaginable. So calling for a ceasefire now, while they are still being held, is the most immoral thing to do. If this body wants a ceasefire, then it should first and foremost be doing everything possible to bring all of the hostages home. And colleagues, empty words are just lip service. Words are not enough. Yet, instead, it's the Hamas monsters capable of exterminating families and torturing children that this body has chosen to defend. I'm sorry, it's abhorrent and it's disgraceful. But colleagues, Hamas not only cares nothing for Israelis and Gazans, I'll surprise you, they also care nothing for Islam. Nothing. I don't know how, according to Islam, Hamas was permitted to rape and sexually abuse women and girls. I don't know. Maybe it's because Hamas doesn't consider Israelis as human beings? But since October 7th, Hamas has fired over 11,000 rockets and missiles at Israel. And today, Hamas proved that murdering Israelis is even more important than preserving the Islamic holy sites they claim to protect. Watch this video. Hours ago, just hours ago, Hamas rocket was fired towards the vicinity of the Temple Mount, Haram el-Sharif. And the Iron Dome, Israel's Iron Dome, intercepted the missile and defended Al-Aqsa Mosque from Hamas. Think about this. Israel is defending Al-Aqsa Mosque from Hamas's missiles. To the Arab League, to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, I ask, this is who you have chosen to defend? A group of genocidal terrorists that prefer jihad at any cost over Islamic holy sites? Just as ISIS destroyed mosques, ISIS is willing to blow up Al-Aqsa. And so many of you are willing to defend them. Unbelievable. Mr. President, Israel's operation in Gaza is not a response to October 7th. It's not. It is to ensure, only to ensure, that such atrocities never happen again. And the only way to do so is to obliterate Hamas's capabilities. There's no other way. There's no other option. Hamas is a cancer and it must be eradicated. And every resolution passed here that doesn't support Hamas's elimination only serves to empower these terrorists and promote a future of regional suffering. Regional. This is what Hamas's Iranian puppet masters want. We know it. But I cannot understand why the Sunni countries of the world are playing along. This is why no matter how many destructive resolutions this body adopts, Israel cannot stop until Hamas is defeated. This is about our future. This is about our survival. And no General Assembly resolution, I apologize, no General Assembly resolution will force us to commit a collective suicide. We will defend ourselves and we will defend our future. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the State of Israel for his statement. And I now call on the distinguished representative of Mauritania, speaking on behalf of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation.
Mr. President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the group of member states belonging to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation in my capacity as a chair of the group. Mr. President, let me thank you immensely for convening this emergency special session once again, following the previous session held on 26 October 2023. We are once again holding a special session on the United Nations General Assembly to demonstrate our strong conviction that the humanitarian situation in occupied Palestinian territory, and in particular in the Gaza Strip, has assumed a very critical dimension that the entire world cannot continue to ignore. The daily loss of innocent lives in Gaza and elsewhere in the occupied Palestinian territory has continued to shock the human conscience. This is due to the escalation of brutal aggression by the Israeli occupation forces against innocent civilian population, including women and children. Against this background, the global call by state and civil society has been very loud in calling for an immediate ceasefire in order to put a definitive end to this unwarranted carnage and growing humanitarian disaster. The OIC call in this august body to assume its responsibility in this regard and to give a strong expression to one of the main purposes of the UN, which is the maintenance of international peace and security and the upholding of international law. In the face of this inability of the United Nations security to act swiftly to prevent the potential global threat to peace and security represented by the ongoing Israeli aggression in the occupied Palestinian territory, the OIC strongly call on the United Nations Assembly as a collective voice of the global community to assume its crucial role of defending the UN Charter and international legality. Accordingly, the OIC strongly deplores the escalation of attacks by the Israeli occupation forces in Gaza and elsewhere in the occupied Palestinian territory in their continuing aggression against the civilian population and their properties. Within the framework of Israeli brutal colonial campaign aimed at annexing Palestinian homes and the violating the sanctity of Holy Al-Quds Mosque and other cultural and religious sites. In this regard, the OIC condemned the recent action of His Excellency the UN Secretary General by invoking Article 99 of the United Nations Charter within the context of bringing about an expeditious halt to the colossal loss of innocent civilian lives and its negative implication for the maintenance of international peace and security. The OIC also warned that the resumption of the hostility following the week-long temporary truce has continued to record human casualty among the vulnerable segment of the population of Gaza and elsewhere in the occupied Palestinian territory, even as there are dangerous signals of the imminent spillover of the crisis to other parts of the entire Middle East region. Since the recent outbreak of armed aggression on the Palestinian people, more than 80% of the population of Gaza has been displaced, while an unprecedented number of civilian deaths have been recorded, among who are about 130 relief workers belong to the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA. We had warned in our early message that the forced displacement of the Gaza population was akin to another Nakba, which subjected Palestinians to forced displacement and a resultant seizure of their ancestral homeland in utter violation of the principle of international law and international humanitarian rights law. As the United Nations recently celebrated the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we draw attention to the incessant violation of human rights and human dignity of the Palestinian people, since they were forced to flee their ancestral land more than 70 years ago. This is accompanied by the brutal attacks against the population of the occupied Palestinian territory by both the Israeli occupation forces and the Israeli settlers communities, who were heavily armed by the occupying power. The OIC calls on this august world body to act swiftly to uphold the human rights and dignity of the oppressed Palestinian people who continue to live under colonial justification, accompanied by an old denial of human, social, and cultural rights. Mr. President, since the outbreak of the aggression in the occupied Palestinian territory, particularly in Gaza, the OIC has continued to call on the principal organ of United Nations to assume their global responsibility by speaking up in the face of historical injustice, mass displacement, and war crime against the Palestinians. In this regard, the OIC call on global actors to exert all pressure on Israel to heed the clarion call for a durable humanitarian ceasefire, including allowing access to humanitarian corridor and cessation of those attacks, which have brought about a colossal loss of lives among the civilian population of Gaza and elsewhere in the occupied Palestinian territory. The OIC further call upon the international community to act swiftly and to hold the Israeli occupation forces accountable for the heinous war crimes against the Palestinian people and humanity at large, and call for immediate intervention to halt this massacre. The OIC also stressed the need to provide international protection for the Palestinian people in conformity with international humanitarian law standard, as has been advocated by the United General Assembly included in the resolution E/S-10/20 of 13 June 2018 by dispatching an international protection force to protect innocent lives from ongoing attack by the occupying forces and the extremist colonial settlers. Furthermore, the OIC reaffirms that peace, security, and stability in the region cannot be achieved without putting adequate moral and political pressure to bear on the Israeli occupation power with a view to ending its colonial occupation of Palestine and oppressive practices against the Palestinian people. This included the restoration of the inalienable right of the Palestinian people, particularly the right to self-determination, national independence, and return to their homeland on the basis of the international law and in accordance with the UN resolution. In calling for a swift action by the United Nations General Assembly, we recall the call by OIC leaders who, in their summit held in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia on 11 November 2023, demonstrated the need for an urgent and concerted global action to resolve the lingering question of Palestine. In this regard, we call for the breaking on the siege of Gaza, the cessation of armed aggression by Israel, the condemnation of attacks and targeting of civilians, the attacks, demolition and destruction of hospitals, religious and cultural sites, as they constitute acts of impunity and violation of international law, among other war crimes and atrocities. Accordingly, we express our commitment to support the mission of the follow-up ministerial committee established by the Arab OIC Summit to interface with the global actors on the need for an urgent resumption of the political process toward funding a lasting but comprehensive peace in the Middle East region and the resolution of the Palestinian national question in accordance with the existing UN resolution and the principle of international law. To conclude, OIC strongly supported the draft resolution presented by Egypt on behalf of the Arab group as a credible way forward to the realization of our common objective of addressing the dire humanitarian situation in the occupied Palestinian territory, including Gaza, as well as a successful breakthrough in the Middle East process. I thank you.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of Mauritania for his statement, and I now invite the distinguished representative of Jamaica, speaking on behalf of the Caribbean community, to take the floor.
Mr. President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the 14 member states of the Caribbean community. Mr. President, CARICOM deeply regrets the circumstances that have necessitated the reconvening of the 10th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly today. We regret that despite genuine attempts to halt the unprecedented levels of death and destruction in Gaza, a way forward was not agreed. We urge an immediate end to the alarming situation in Gaza and emphasize that there will be no winners at the end of this war. Instead, the mistrust, fear, and insecurity that have come to characterize the relationship between Israel and Palestine will mount. On this note, Mr. President, CARICOM makes 3 critical appeals. First, we call on all parties to lay down their instruments of war in the name of humanity. We, the people of the United Nations, have affirmed our faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, and in the equal rights of men and women and of nations, large and small. On this premise, we have resolved to unite our strength for the maintenance of international peace and security. The situation in Gaza demands this unity of purpose for the preservation of life and for the stability of the security environment in the Middle East. Guns, rockets, and bombs cannot achieve these goals and will not broker security for Palestinians nor Israelis. Second, we reiterate the call for immediate and adequate humanitarian access so that civilians can receive the support they so desperately need at this time. A humanitarian ceasefire is urgently needed so that the United Nations and its partners can have the space and the conditions to reach the people of Gaza and to attend to their needs. CARICOM's third appeal, Mr. President, is for the parties to take steps that would allow for a return to the negotiating table. This includes the release of hostages taken on 7th of October, as well as the release of Palestinians being held for unacceptable periods of time in Israeli prisons without charge. It also includes ending illegal settler violence against Palestinians in the West Bank and the infringement of Palestinians' rights to freedom of movement. Mr. President, a permanent resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict requires very strong political will on both sides. Those with influence over the two parties must work to secure this political will for settling all the outstanding questions in the conflict. Chief among those questions are the establishment of a state for the Palestinian people and guaranteed security for Israel. As member states of the United Nations, we have a collective responsibility to devise ways of moving forward on these critical issues. Previous resolutions of the Security Council, the General Assembly, and other UN organs provide the legal and moral bases, but we must now seriously contemplate how we take these forward. The status quo, or worse, must not be allowed to continue. Mr. President, CARICOM is at your disposal to advance these questions. I thank you.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of Jamaica. And I now invite the distinguished representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, speaking on behalf of the group of friends in defense of the Charter of the United Nations, to take the floor.
Thank you.
Mr. President, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela has the honor to take the floor on behalf of the group of friends in defense of the United Nations Charter. Its member states would like to thank you for convening this important meeting in the light of the continuing worsening of the situation on the ground. Mr. President, more than 2 months have gone by now since the beginning of this regrettable spiral of violence and destruction, which has caused the death of thousands of innocent civilians, particularly women, boys, and girls, including more than 100 of UN humanitarian workers, and the destruction of thousands of homes in the Gaza Strip. 2 months have gone by, during which the Palestinian civilian population in the Gaza Strip have lived hell on earth, as described by the United Nations Secretary General. There is today no safe space in the Gaza Strip for the civilian population. They are being bombed indiscriminately, day and night, from the air, from the sea, and from the land, along with cruel land operations by the Israeli occupying forces. There is no space for civil infrastructure that is safe from air attacks. Refugee camps, which house more than 1.3 million Palestinian civilians out of the more than 1.9 million which were forcibly displaced during recent months, have been the target of repeated attacks. The Commissioner General of UNRWA also recently warned, and as the figures show, that the United Nations flag is no longer any protection for Gazan civilians. The schools and hospitals have not been liberated, and they undergo constant attacks. The lives of babies, girls, boys, women, men, old people, the wounded are all in danger. International humanitarian law has been totally neglected over recent weeks. So the question is, where are all those people who in other cases have appealed to the notion of the responsibility to protect for the interest and well-being of the human rights of millions of Palestinians who have been subject to years of aggression under the legal Israeli occupation? How much longer will we be witnesses of the use of the veto in the Security Council to protect Israel, the occupying power, from its accountability for the crimes that it is perpetrating blatantly and systematically in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, the Gaza Strip? Mr. President, today the international community is witnessing a genuine carnage against the Palestinian people. We regret to admit it, but the body that the United Nations Charter entrusted with ensuring the maintenance of international peace and security has been incapable on many occasions, and the most recently being last Friday, to fully and effectively exercise its functions. It has not even been able to adopt a very necessary resolution demanding unequivocally a ceasefire. We cannot deliberately ignore the humanitarian catastrophe that is taking place under our eyes. We must act. We must do so now to avoid further losses of human life. As was correctly stated by the Commissioner General of UNRWA, the humanitarian situation now is unsustainable. Now, in this context, the member states of our group of friends of the United Nations Charter must insist on the importance of ensuring the full respect for and the upholding of the provisions of international humanitarian law, including the principles of proportionality and distinction, as well as the safety of all civilians, particularly boys and girls, and all humanitarian and medical staff on the ground, in line with the relevant provisions of the General Assembly and Security Council resolutions, including Resolution A/ES10/21, which was approved more than a month ago by this body in the face of the ongoing crisis. The current situation is really a breaking point, as the Secretary General of the United Nations stated. He invoked the provisions of Article 99 of the Charter, and we welcome this step. We believe that this is the right way forward in the light of the seriousness and the continuing worsening of the situation on the ground. Therefore, we reiterate our demand for an immediate ceasefire and the end of the ongoing atrocities. This is not just necessary in the name of humanity, but also to ensure that humanitarian assistance, including crucial supplies for saving lives, such as sufficient fuel, to ensure basic humanitarian operations can be undertaken, as well as food, medicine, drinking water, should enter the Gaza Strip and be rapidly distributed to all those who desperately need it. In the same manner, we also call for the adoption of urgent measures aimed at guaranteeing, on the one hand, the security and well-being of all civilians, and also to ensure the provision of international protection to the Palestinian civilian population in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip. and this on the basis of the recommendations made by the United Nations Secretary-General in his 2018 report to the Secretary-General and other relevant resolutions from the Security Council. Mr. President, we also renew our appeal that we ensure unhindered humanitarian access in a safe and on a large-scale way in order to meet the urgent needs that have been created by the current catastrophe in Gaza. And it is a genuine crisis which has been provoked by human action. And this is key to avoid the total collapse of critical civilian infrastructure, which would lead inevitably to more civilian victims and to starvation, illness, poverty, and suffering and desperation, which is even greater, worsening the already humanitarian crisis in Gaza, where more than half of the population is made up of boys, girls, and refugees, and more than 85% have been internally displaced since the beginning of this escalation in violence that began more than 2 months ago. Once again, we insist that a lasting, comprehensive solution to the Palestinian question in all its dimensions and in line with international law can only be achieved through peaceful means. Therefore, we ask for urgent measures to be taken to deal with the underlying causes of this prolonged conflict. At its heart, there are years of the occupation and its consequences, and to also establish the responsibility for those crimes that have been committed. Now more than ever before, we must urgently establish a credible political horizon leading to bringing about the right to self-determination for the Palestinian people by achieving independence and sovereignty for the Palestinian state within pre-1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. That means a political horizon that leads to achieving the two-state solution on the basis of the relevant resolutions of the United Nations. In conclusion, we reassert our full commitment to preserve, promote, and defend the United Nations Charter. This is a historic treaty which represents a genuine act of faith in the best of humanity, and so far, although it's been the subject of ongoing attacks, continues to make us linked to our promise to protect future generations from the scourge of war and to ensure respect for the dignity and the value of the individual. Let us act collectively and in a responsible way without any further delay to meet our duties under the United Nations Charter. And its effects will include the recent adoption by an overwhelming majority of members of the Arab group of that resolution. Thank you very much.
I should like to thank the representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, and I now call on the distinguished representative of Pakistan on behalf of a group of countries.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for convening this resumed 10th emergency session of the General Assembly in response to the request of the Arab and the OIC groups. I have the honor of delivering this statement on behalf of a group of countries which include Algeria, Bolivia, China, Cuba, Egypt, Eritrea, Islamic Republic of Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Libya, Nigeria, Syrian Arab Republic, Venezuela, and my own delegation, Pakistan. Mr. President, we are witnessing a human tragedy of epic proportions unfolding in front of our eyes. Israel's indiscriminate bombardments from the air, land, and sea, along with intense ground operations across Gaza, has now continued for over 2 months, killing more than 18,000 people, 70% of them women and children,
and wounding close to 50,000. Entire families and neighborhoods have been wiped out. According to recent reports, the number of people killed is the highest in proportion to the population since this century began. The Palestinians are being bombed without mercy or compunction. Their essential lifeline of water, food, medicines, and fuel have been cut off. 1.93 million of the 2.2 million Gazans have been internally displaced. And even those displaced cannot hide from the Israeli bombs. According to the UN Secretary General, I quote, "The people of Gaza are being told to move like human pinballs, ricocheting between ever smaller slivers of the South, without any of the basics for survival. But nowhere in Gaza is safe," unquote. 134 staff members of the UN Relief Works Agencies, UNRWA, in Palestine have tragically lost their lives, many with their families and their homes. This is the highest ever recorded killing of United Nations personnel in the history of the United Nations. The international community should honor their memory. UNRWA and other UN agencies have been at the forefront of playing a critical role in the provision of humanitarian assistance to the people of Gaza. We salute their untiring efforts and commitment. The letter recently addressed to you, Mr. President, by the UNRWA Commissioner General Philippe Lazzarini at, I quote, "the darkest hour in the agency's 75-year history," unquote, reminds us that the, quote, "humanitarian situation is now untenable," unquote. Lazzarini has, I quote, "implored the General Assembly to take action," unquote. Mr. President, we are appalled at the magnitude of the suffering being faced by the helpless Palestinian civilians, especially children and women. The collective punishment endured by the besieged people of Gaza is unprecedented in modern history. We must also be appalled at those who, by blocking the call for ceasefire in the Security Council, have enabled the continuation of the Israeli slaughter of innocents. We laud the Secretary General for invoking Article 99 of the UN Charter, the first time during his tenure, terming the situation being at a breaking point. He has noted in his letter addressed to the UN Security Council that, and I quote, "there is a high risk of the total collapse of the humanitarian support system in Gaza, which would have devastating consequences," unquote. He particularly stressed that, and I quote again, "there is clearly a serious risk of aggravating existing threats to the maintenance of international peace and security," unquote. We deeply regret that calls from the UN Secretary General and the UN General Assembly have not been heeded by Israel, and it continues its criminal attacks against the Palestinian people. Israel has also ignored the call from the Security Council to comply with its obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law, notably with regard to the protection of civilians, especially children, and to refrain from depriving the civilian population in the Gaza Strip of basic services and humanitarian assistance indispensable to their survival. We strongly and unequivocally condemn the indiscriminate use of force by Israel, Israel's attacks on civilians, civilian objects and infrastructure, blockading of water, food and fuel, as well as the forced displacement of people within the occupied territory are flagrant violations of international humanitarian law and amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity and may amount to the crime of genocide. Mr. President, We are deeply disappointed that the UN Security Council once again failed to call for a ceasefire in Gaza on 8 December, even in the face of a human tragedy of epic proportions taking place there. This is unjustifiable. Despite the invocation of Article 99 by the Secretary General and his warnings of humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, the Council has failed to perform its primary responsibility. Continuation of Israel's campaign in occupied Palestine is aggravating human suffering with massive civilian casualties and forced displacement of millions of Palestinian people. It could also trigger a wider and more dangerous conflict. A heavy responsibility rests on all who have contributed to the prolongation of uninterrupted bombing of the people of Gaza. We reject Israel's portrayal of its aggressive actions as anti-terrorism measures and its relentless bombing of Gaza as an exercise of self-defense. The root cause of the crisis lies in Israel's prolonged occupation and denial of Palestinians' inalienable right to self-determination. Israel's murderous campaign against the occupied people of Palestine struggling for their freedom cannot be justified under the guise of self-defense. Mr. President, the joint extraordinary Arab and Islamic summit held in Riyadh on 11 November 2023 underscored the centrality of the Palestinian cause and extended full support for the legitimate struggle of the Palestinian people to liberate all their occupied territories and the need to end the Israeli aggression against the Palestinian people. Described the ongoing Israeli aggression as a retaliatory war crime that cannot be justified under any guise, and demanded that all countries stop exporting weapons and ammunition to the occupation authorities that are used by their army and terrorist settlers to kill the Palestinian people and destroy their homes, hospitals, schools, mosques, churches, and all their properties. We welcome the diplomatic efforts undertaken by the Ministerial Committee mandated by the Joint Arab-Islamic Extraordinary Summit, chaired by the Foreign Minister of Saudi Arabia, including visits to P5 capitals. We hope that their efforts will lead to restoring and reinvigorating the peace process. We consider it necessary to intensify international efforts in the search for a durable and peaceful solution. Therefore, we reiterate the demand to advance the peace process in accordance with the resolutions of the Security Council, the UN, and the Arab Peace Initiative aimed at finding a just and comprehensive solution and establishing an independent Palestinian state according to the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. We also welcome the efforts undertaken by Egypt, Jordan, and Qatar to facilitate the provision of humanitarian assistance for alleviating the suffering of the Palestinian people. Mr. President, in conclusion, it is our hope that the resolution A/ES 10/22 adopted by the General Assembly, acting under Uniting for Peace process, which seeks an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, will be implemented. The Israeli killing machine must be stopped in Gaza and the West Bank. In addition to an immediate humanitarian ceasefire and provision of unimpeded humanitarian access to the besieged people of Gaza, we also demand the following. 1. Establishment of a special tribunal and accountability mechanism to investigate Israel's atrocity crimes, identify and prosecute those responsible for war crimes committed, and to provide reparations for damage, loss, or injury arising from these crimes committed by the Israeli occupation forces. 2. Establish an international protection mechanism to protect Palestinian civilians, especially women and children in Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, from further attacks and oppression by the occupation forces and extremist colonialist settlers. And 3, we consider it necessary to intensify international efforts in the search for a durable and peaceful solution of the Palestine question. I thank you, Mr. President.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of Pakistan, and I now call on the distinguished representative of Malta to take the floor. Of Zambia. Excuse me. I now call on the distinguished representative of Zambia, speaking on behalf of the African group, to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Africa Group, I want to express my sincere thanks and gratitude to you, Mr. President, for convening this timely and important meeting. I also extend my profound thanks to the permanent representative of the Arab Republic of Egypt and the permanent representative of the Islamic Republic of Mauritania in their capacities as the chair of the Arab Group and chair of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, respectively, for requesting the resumption of the 10th emergency special session of the General Assembly. Mr. President, we are meeting today at a very difficult time. The situation in Gaza and the occupied territories is deteriorating and remains a matter of deep concern. The ongoing bombardment of Gaza has claimed thousands of lives, including thousands of children, not to mention the injured, those trapped under the rubble, and the dire humanitarian situation has dramatically worsened an already fragile situation. The cost on the civilian population is unbearable and unacceptable by any standards. We condemn the escalating violence and loss of civilian lives. All human life matters and must be protected, as well as their fundamental rights and dignity must be upheld. We strongly urge the international community and specifically the United Nations to formulate a comprehensive plan for rebuilding the destroyed civilian infrastructure and properties in the affected areas. The plan should encompass not only the physical reconstruction of buildings and facilities, but also the restoration of essential services and support systems that form the backbone of daily life and economic activities. It is imperative that this initiative becomes a central component of all subsequent deliberations and actions, ensuring that the recovery process is integral to the path forward, promoting stability, fostering long-term peace and prosperity in the region. We have regrettably witnessed the inability of the Security Council to act and adequately deliver on this issue, while the situation was deteriorating in an unprecedented scale. It is crucial for all parties to demonstrate genuine commitment to achieving lasting peace in the region. We call for an immediate ceasefire and cessation of hostilities and urge all the parties to engage in a meaningful dialogue to de-escalate tension and find a peaceful resolution to the conflict. We call for the release of prisoners and hostages. The cycle of violence and suffering has to end, and a durable solution must be found through a just and comprehensive peace. Mr. President, today more than ever, we should intensify our efforts to find a just and lasting solution to the conflict based on the two-state solution and a sovereign Palestine state with East Jerusalem as its capital in accordance with the relevant United Nations resolutions and within the framework of the relevant African Union pronouncements. Africa's support for Palestine's cause is premised on the values of freedom, justice, and humanitarian principles that Africa defends in the international fora, alongside all those striving to ensure that Palestine regains its right to exist as a viable state. Africa has consistently expressed deep concern at the consequences of impunity, unilateral policies, and provocations and non-adherence to international law. Mr. President, we therefore welcome the General Assembly resolution adopted on 12th December, demanding for a humanitarian ceasefire and that all parties comply with obligations under international law, including the international humanitarian law, notably with regard to the protection of civilians. Mr. President, I now deliver a national statement in my capacity as Zambia. Mr. President, Zambia supported the resolution on the protection of civilians and upholding legal and humanitarian obligations on December 12th, and aligns itself with the statement of the Africa Group at large. The grave humanitarian situation in Gaza demanded our most urgent attention, and that is what this General Assembly gave it by adopting the resolution. How can we stand by idly and watch as innocent children, women, and many others die? How can we do nothing or say nothing when the hundreds and thousands remain under siege? Mr. President, in light of the gravity of the humanitarian situation, the focus should primarily be on saving lives and livelihoods. This is a time to pause and allow our humanitarian side to take action. And so Zambia reemphasizes the call for an immediate ceasefire in the Gaza Strip in order to allow for the much-needed humanitarian assistance and to reach the people of Gaza. We support the call for the release of hostages and the cessation of all aggression. This was the basis for the support for the resolution, and it is the hope that there will be a cessation of hostilities to allow for the humanitarian aid to be carried out. On the wider question of Israel-Palestine, Zambia remains steadfast in the belief of a two-state solution. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Zambia for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
President, Excellencies, the circumstances leading to the resumption of this emergency special session are deeply regrettable. We are facing a catastrophic situation by all accounts, exacerbated by a Security Council which has been unable to find agreement on how to respond to the needs of the crisis. In this regard, Malta has fully supported the Secretary General's invocation of Article 99. We echo his principled belief that we must not give up. The hostilities in Gaza are fueling unprecedented levels of human suffering. Public order in Gaza is now on the verge of collapse. This scale of loss and destruction is a serious threat to regional peace and will have lasting international repercussions. Malta reiterates that an immediate humanitarian ceasefire is now critical. It is for this reason that we have voted in favor and co-sponsored the resolution last Tuesday and in the Council on 8 December. Malta also continues to unreservedly condemn Hamas's acts of terror, including the heinous attacks of 7 October and the indiscriminate rocket fire on Israeli civilians. Hamas's strategy of embedding itself among civilians and civilian infrastructure in Gaza and reports of sexual violence committed are also reprehensible. Malta once again calls for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages in accordance with Security Council Resolution 2712 and further deplores any acts of violence that may be they may be suffering whilst in captivity. We recognize Israel's right to protect her people, but all actions must be in line with international humanitarian law, including the principles of distinction, proportionality, and necessity. Nevertheless, the fact that civilians in Gaza are lacking the basic needs for survival is a matter of urgency. The healthcare system is on its knees. Collapsing hospitals and the handful of UNRWA facilities are sheltering over 1 million people, compounding serious risks of widespread disease. Amid such inhumane conditions, children also continue to suffer disproportionately, their futures seemingly buried under the rubble. Commissioner General Lazzarini has been clear on UNRWA's fate if nothing is done to alleviate its impossible burden. An unprecedented number of UN employees have been killed. UNRWA will soon be unable to pursue its mandate. Inaction is not an option if we are to preserve any potential of a political solution. We must stress that there is no scenario which justifies the denial of aid for 2.2 million people, 80% of whom have been displaced. In conformity with international law, all parties are obliged to ensure that civilians and civilian infrastructure are protected. Unhindered humanitarian aid and the safety of UN and humanitarian workers must be guaranteed. The only way to achieve these imperatives is through a humanitarian ceasefire. President, the situation in the West Bank has seen unprecedented escalations in the past 8 weeks, including through increasingly heavy incursions, restrictions, and mass detainment of Palestinians. The resurgence of illegal settler encroachment and violence is particularly concerning. We stress that settlements are illegal under international law and constitute an obstacle to peace. Furthermore, we are alarmed at escalations along the Blue Line and the Red Sea. We strongly call for all parties, including non-state actors in the region, to exercise restraint, de-escalate, and respect the norms of international law. Further conflict fronts must be avoided at all costs. Within this volatile context, peace will only be achievable through dialogue towards a political horizon which aims to holistically address both Israel's security concerns and the legitimate aspirations of Palestinians, including their right to self-determination. Malta reaffirms its unwavering commitment to a two-state solution along the pre-1967 borders, addressing the legitimate aspirations of both sides, with Jerusalem as a future capital of two states, living side by side in peace and security, in line with all relevant Security Council resolutions and internationally agreed parameters. We remain convinced that this is the only path to a lasting and sustainable peace in the Middle East. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta, and I now give the floor to the representative of Singapore.
Mr. President, Singapore welcomes the resumption of the 10th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly to discuss the situation in Gaza. We share the concerns expressed by the Secretary General in his letter dated the 6th of December, which he sent to the Security Council, and in which he described, I quote, that current conditions are making it impossible for meaningful humanitarian operations to be conducted, unquote. We also agree with his assessment that the international community has a responsibility to use all its influence to prevent further escalation and end this crisis. Mr. President, I take this opportunity to express Singapore's strong support for the leadership of Secretary General Antonio Guterres and his tireless efforts to address the unfolding humanitarian tragedy in Gaza. We also commend the critical role played by many dedicated and courageous United Nations officials and agencies in providing humanitarian assistance to civilians in Gaza. In particular, the role played by UNRWA, or the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees in the Near East. We express our deepest condolences to the families of the 135 UNRWA staff who have lost their lives. The Singapore government and the Singapore Red Cross have worked closely with the Egyptian government and the Egyptian Red Crescent to provide humanitarian supplies to Gaza. And we will continue to work closely with our friends and partners to support these humanitarian relief efforts. Mr. President, we are meeting today because the humanitarian situation in Gaza has deteriorated significantly, with over 18,000 Palestinians killed in Gaza and up to 1.9 million people reportedly displaced, which represents about 85% of the population of Gaza. The Commissioner General of UNRWA sent a letter to the President of the General Assembly on the 7th of December, warning of an irreversible disaster. And he also said that the humanitarian situation in Gaza is now untenable, with people, and I quote, desperate, hungry, and terrified. We're therefore disappointed that the Security Council was not able to adopt the draft humanitarian resolution put forward by the United Arab Emirates last week, which Singapore had co-sponsored. Mr. President, Singapore also co-sponsored the emergency special session resolution entitled Protection of Civilians and Upholding Legal and Humanitarian Obligations that the General Assembly adopted with an overwhelming majority of 153 votes in favor on the 12th of December. Singapore supports the call made in this resolution for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. This is essential for the urgent and unhindered provision of humanitarian aid to civilians throughout Gaza. I wish to reiterate Singapore's grave concern at the worsening humanitarian situation in Gaza, which has led to the loss of many thousands of innocent civilian lives. Singapore also supports the call made in the resolution for all parties to comply with their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law, notably with regard to the protection of civilians. We recognize that Israel has the right to defend its citizens and territory, but in exercising this right, Israel must comply fully with international humanitarian law. This means responding in a proportionate manner. This means avoiding the indiscriminate killing of civilians. This means avoiding the collective punishment of civilians. And this means avoiding the permanent mass displacement of civilians. Singapore strongly supports the call made in the resolution for the immediate release of all remaining hostages. The taking of hostages is prohibited by international law. Hamas and other parties involved must ensure the safety and security of the hostages and facilitate their immediate release. Mr. President, it is a fact that the heinous terrorist attack carried out by Hamas in Israel on the 7th of October led to the killing of over 1,200 Israelis, the majority of whom were innocent civilians. We regret that the resolution adopted on the 12th of December does not condemn or even make reference to the actions of Hamas. Singapore wishes to place on record our view that terrorist attacks carried out by any party cannot be condoned or justified by any rationale. Singapore continues to hold the view that the only viable path to a durable, just, and comprehensive solution to this crisis is a negotiated two-state solution, consistent with relevant UN Security Council resolutions. We support the right of Israelis and Palestinians to live within secure borders. Both Palestinians and Israelis deserve to live in peace, security, and dignity. And we call on leaders from both sides to show leadership, exercise restraint, and take the difficult but necessary steps towards a two-state solution. I thank you very much for your attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of